Officially now. Oh, here comes Pauline probably. Recording. Does it say this session is being recorded? Okay, you're being recorded. Hey, Pauline, how are you today?
Good. How's everyone?
Well, thank you.
All right. So Sydney's text said she might be late.
Yep.
Okay.
She's driving home from work.
Okay. Um, so what I did was I'm recording it now. My sense is let's get started. We have a number of people to talk, and then maybe we can have a discussion about the different topics and getting a little bit more engaged if that's helpful, or if there's something somebody wants to cover or something somebody wants to raise. One of the things I did, I took the list on the research from peg, put it into a table, and then created a grid for myself so that I have a response pretty much to everything that's on there. That's just as a study guide for me, And what I've intentionally done is I've been writing a lot more or typing a lot more than I would, rather than cut and paste, so I can, get the words in my head. But if you'd like, I'm going to start with Yin. Is that okay for everybody? All right. I've never met the man. So I think this is very straightforward. I mean, I think case study in some ways sounds simplistic. It is exactly what it says, but it's an empirical inquiry that investigates a contemporary phenomenon within its real life context when the boundaries between phenomena and context are not clearly evident, and in which multiple sources of evidence are used. But and you can do that a couple different ways. Now the issues why case study can be criticized. Part is if you do a single case study, so well, great, you looked at one school, one thing. How do you know that goes across to others? And people could feel that it's insufficient. I'm going to do a case study and I've asked to do a multiple case study or at least a two case study. And my chair felt very strongly that it's going to make it a lot more valid. It's going to make it a lot more work, or twice as much work. Um, um, Also, the other part, another issue is the intense involvement of the researcher in the study of the case could cause bias in the findings. I'm concerned about that personally. I think I have a bias on the topic I'm dealing with, and I'm going to have to certainly identify that and try to mitigate that. Which is, I think, most of these academics are crazy, which will be us soon. And some people suggest that case study research is useful only as exploratory for establishing a hypothesis. Did someone just join us? Just want to see. Oh, what do we got?
Hi.
All right, we just started and we're recording, but all I did was very preliminary coverage of case study. We have everybody on, including Anita, but not Chris. I'm talking about some of the issues with case study, and then there's the common claim: is it really a scientific way to do that? But why you use case study, it answers the kind of the why, how questions, and that's you're trying to figure out why something's happening, and what's causing it. So those are kind of the things that you can use a case study for, to really focus in on a specific thing. You can go more in depth on a specific phenomena to try to study it. You know, some people say it's a way to, useful to establish a basis for future research. Well, I found that in this case, should we research that broader, more fully? You can develop new theories or use it to test existing theories. Now, my this is a summary of my summary that I sent and put out there. There is a debate about how many cases you should be dealing with. Eisenhart suggested 4 to 10, but Yin and another person, Stake, suggest that one can be acceptable. But the key is to justify your choice. But as I just explained earlier, while I was going to do a one case study, it was really pushed to do a two case study. Oops. You have to go through and plan for the case, make sure it's appropriate, decide how many, and then really it's the gathering, analysis, and data collection, which bleeds into many other things we're talking about. Normal, you'd use similar tools to other things, data, interview, surveys, how to do the surveys, how to capture the video, and then certainly you need to code all of that information. So I'm not going to go through that. And then you need to do your coding, find your your synthesis, your content, and narrow it down through. In my case, I'll probably using kind of what Saldana and Huberman were talking about in the presentation I saw from Saldana this summer, and from the chapter that Peg identified as something we should be looking at. I think it's pretty simple in terms of what it is. Questions or anything about that? Anything you think so? Well, you're really missing this, Roy, you won't offend me. Okay.
Which chapter in the Saldana Huberman refers to what you're going to use, Roy?
Say that again, please, Anita.
Which chapter in the Saldana Huberman?
That was, I think, chapter 4. It's in the. It was in Peg's notes. She said that we should be aware of that chapter. I have it right here. Oh, you can't see that. Yeah, I think it was chapter 4.
Roy?
Yeah.
Why would you choose to do case study over another kind of method?
Well, because what I want to really look at, I think that I'm trying to discover why colleges are struggling. And I think the only way I can do that is to go in and look at colleges that specifically struggled and look at all the pieces. Now, part of it is deciding which pieces, who should I talk to? What pieces should I deal with? I think by doing that, interviews and stuff, and looking at a specific case, or in this case, 2 cases. Now, the question I have, and I have to get it, is you can do a 2-case study. I could do one that's successful and one that failed and decide if that's a better way to go. But I think for the topic I'm going to, I didn't see a better way to do it. I originally tried to see if I could do it quantitatively. Can I look at data that can tell me this? And it really, I don't think there was enough data there to do that. Because I really wanted to approach this, do schools that use data better achieve better than schools that use a different kind of approach? I tried it every which way and it just never worked. And I wound up coming back to case study. What other ways you think, if I want to study why a college struggles, why some college struggles, and try to understand what the issues are, or the converse is really take a look at the case of schools that shouldn't have been successful. So my selection criteria is going to be very careful. The size of the school, the geographical locations of the school, the majors that they offer, where schools like that are failing, but some schools are not. If I look at a school like that, what other approach would people say, oh, you could do this approach that might be useful for that?
Well, I think the strength in case study for you is that you have multiple strategies on the data collection. You can look at it from, all these different directions. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't see any other method that has that capability. And you might have a quantitative. You might look at something quantitatively too.
And in a case study, if you read the notes that I sent, that's highlighted that you can do both qualitative and quantitative to form it. And I think that there is absolutely that, because there is a lot of data on institutions that is out there via iPads and other mechanisms that might help inform or be indicators. I actually may use the data to help select the schools too.
Right, and then you could measure those schools against the data.
I agree.
Yeah.
But what are the unique data collection methods that are not in others then?
I don't think that there are unique data collection methods in a study. I think that the data collection methods we've talked about cross barriers. Now, I think when you're getting to something like, and somebody correct me on this, but you looked at ethnography, Bernadette. You may really get deeper in terms of doing it. I'm looking at doing interviews, but one of my questions would be, would the Seidman approach be appropriate for a case study interview? Or is that really for doing a deeper dive on some things? I'm really a little perplexed by that.
I don't think so. I think Seidman would be fine because all you're doing is the three interviews. I don't think you're going to go any deeper with ethnography. I think where the deepness comes in is you're submerging yourself within that culture. You're doing interviews to pick out more information, but it's the fact that you're living amongst the people that really make it different with ethnography. But it's also a limitation because you can, as the researcher, influence either positive or negative. So there are some problems with that. But I think Seidman would be fine. Because you would want that.
That'd be a lot of work. If I want to interview 10 people at each school, I've got 30 interviews to do, times 2.
Right. That's
And just remember, you got to transcribe all those interviews too.
I'm going to find some great transcription software, trust me.
I was actually asking what Kathleen was referring to also in terms of the data collection that you were talking about. Was it just more in depth with one case? Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, I was seeing that. I thought it was a good choice of methods because he's able to use those means of data collection kind of freely. He doesn't have to focus on one necessarily, but case study seems to lend itself to multiple lenses where, like Bernadette said, with ethnography, you have to immerse yourself in the culture, or narrative, you're focused on the story, trying to tell a story. Anyway, so I don't know. That's a question they might ask us all, if not on this, I would think on our perspectives. Yeah.
Why did you choose your methodology?
Yeah, over this method.
And I think the idea of comparing, contrasting will be something that they will possibly ask. And one of the things I'm trying to put together is another matrix that'll they already exist. I don't have to create it, but a matrix. Look at a matrix that shows the differences, so you can quickly assume.
Right. Well, Roy, you could do ethnography because you're immersed in the culture. You could do it on the place right where you're at. You wouldn't, but you could.
I would worry so much about, I think bias would be such a fair variable there because.
Yeah. Well, you could say that. You could say I could have done ethnography, but I could see a greater bias because I know the players. I know that I think I don't know.
Yeah. Can I ask a hypothetical?
Please.
If he could also potentially set it up as a phenomenology if we were talking about struggle and colleges struggle and doing multiple cases, so meaning many more, but maybe not as deeply. And then you're talking about colleges as the main source of information. Does that sound reasonable? Or, I mean, I don't think it would be right for your case study because you're looking at one or two. I understand that, but what are the differences? If we were to, could it be looked
at that in a question? But my question on top of that is, I am studying a phenomena, so that's where I get a little confused between studying phenomenology. This is the conversation I think I had with Chris last week.
Okay,
but case study can look at a phenomena. It's just a broader lens of a phenomena, I think, because you're coming at it from all directions. And I think it's the means of collecting data and how it's governed. I think it goes back to your researcher identity too, I think.
Roy, I had the same total debate with mine with case study and phenomenology because mine is a phenomenon also. But I think what it came down for me is more of the output. Like what I don't so much want to get out what the essence of everybody's experience is. What I want to get out of it is more of the nuts and bolts about, people's perceptions and, things that were in place or mentoring or something like that caused, an increase in women superintendents. So I looked at it from the output perspective and decided that a case study was more appropriate.
So, but can somebody tell me what the difference is? Because I can't answer that question today.
So a phenomenology is going to be, say you find 5 colleges that have been struggling with extinction or whatever. and you decide that you're going to interview 5 people at each college. And I'm making up these numbers, okay? So what you would want to do in a phenomenology, what you would want to get out of that is what was the shared essence of their experience going through that struggle, thinking they were going to close? What was their shared experience? How does that bubble up into the essence of what they were all going through together?
As opposed to understanding why it happened.
Yes.
Got it.
So for me, I want to know why it happened. I want to know, was it because these people found mentors? Was it because school boards were changing? Was it because something was happening in the certification training programs? Like, that's what I want to know. Now, if I wanted to know just what their shared experiences were, I would definitely go for the phenomenology. But I want more of the practical things that actually happened, which is why I chose a case study. So like Megan would say, yes, there's elements of phenomenology in the case study, but what the output that I want is pragmatic. I want to know why this happened.
Right. And so that's kind of researcher identity. That's the paradigm then, right?
Yep. Yeah, because
pragmatism.
Yeah. Like, will I ask them about their experiences and find out what's in common? Yeah, I'll do that in the coding, but that's not the
focus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, like for me, I want to know why, but there's no description of what yet. So I feel like I have to be able to story that and understand it, and then a case study could come second.
Yeah.
You know, once I've got kind of those outliers, because there really aren't even those outliers.
Yeah.
So.
And then if I remember correctly, with grounded theory, I mean, there are elements of that too, only because if you're looking at a process, right, and defining a process, when you're saying nuts and bolts, if that should be a process. I don't know if that is for your case, but that reminds me of grounded theory as well.
Well, I could see a model coming out of both those studies that are case studies, which Christine told us is not necessarily grounded theory, but I could see you having enough outliers to create some kind of a visual that would take somebody through the process.
Roy, I just wanted to tell you that I keep hearing in your presentation about what you're after, the idea of visioning. And I don't know if you can do anything with that, but it seems important to you. And I think maybe that.
What do you mean by visioning?
The connection, the potential connection that may exist between a college's or university's success and its vision for self. That just seems, it comes across when you start to talk about what your passion is in this. That's what I hear. So I thought I would tell you that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Who else would like to talk about their topic, and then we can continue this conversation, which has been really helpful to me.
Do you want me to go? Since we touched upon ethnography
No,
anyway.
That's a nice idea.
Okay. In the sheet, in the information that I attached to the Common Doc, I gave you a list of books that were ethnographies. We read Street Corner Society, but Tally's Corner was another one. And I was in the midst of reading Do Muslim Women Need Saving? These are all ethnographies. I also read another one that's on there as well. Basically, what you're going to do is submerge yourself into the culture. Its origins were in anthropology and sociology, and now it's making its way into, or has been making its way into, regular research. The biggest thing that I got out of looking more deeply at it is that idea of insider's point of view. You want to make sure you're in there, you're living with the people, you are going to be there every step of the way. And one of the key things as data collection, you have to make sure that does an ethnography suit the question that you're asking? That's the key thing, because you could go through this whole thing, submerge yourself in this culture, and it's not going to answer your question. So you have to make sure that the question is going to be answered using ethnography as, your means. I'm trying to think what else. You're going to look at with your data, you're going to look at interviews, artifacts, journals as part of it, as well as living there and, you know, living this whole culture. The biggest problem is going to be the limitations that come along with ethnography, which are going to be time. It's major time consuming. It's going to, you have to make sure as a researcher you don't lose your own identity when you're living within that culture. And you also may have your experience, your being there may impact the people themselves, the culture negatively. So you have to be aware of all those things.
Isn't
Once
that
you
the
gather,
going native saying?
yep, that's got that going native. Yep. You're going to lose your identity by going into, you know, becoming part of them. So there's two different things going on. You can impact them negatively, but you could lose yourself and your own identity in the meantime. So that's it. I mean, think about that. That's kind of a scary thing, that you could go into somebody else's culture and lose yourself. Once you get your information, your interviews, you're going to sit down, you're going to look for a common theme, like we do with everything else. And once you get all your data, you're going to sit down and you're going to be writing a narrative. This is what's going on. That narrative is going to be very, they say in most of the stuff that I read, rich descriptions of the culture. So that's really your outside. You're going to give a picture of that culture.
Are you writing, like, you know, how do you document that? So I know if I go and interview somebody, I can do that. I can code. I can do all this other stuff. How, when you're doing an ethnography, do you collect the data or memorialize it?
You're going to be keeping journals and writings as to what's going on, what you're seeing. That's really one of the negative or disadvantages of ethnography, is you're interpreting, you're making the interpretation of what's going on in that culture, but your view might be seeing it differently than you might see it. So there are some questions about how good an ethnographic study is compared to other studies. There's some questions about validity.
Bernie, isn't that when we would make a memo?
Yep. As you're going through, you would memo out your stuff. You saw this. So it's again, time is of the essence with this. This is years of work. This is not something you're going to do. I mean, you could do your dissertation on it, but it's going to take a lot of time. And a lot of the stuff that I read, they also talk about getting funding and grants. That's for a study after you get your doctorate. It's not something you probably want to do for your dissertation.
Yeah,
but again, you could see aspects of it in different areas as well.
Pauline.
Can I ask,
Pauline.
Would Street Corner Society be considered a mix of ethnography and case study?
I think they always categorize it as an ethnography. Anything that I read, that's what they point to. But I guess you could say because it's about a certain group, but I'm not sure. I think they just title it ethnography.
I saw it as ethnography, but I wonder if because of the depth of it and one particular culture, whether it could also be considered case. I don't know. These are the questions popping up.
It's also cited as an example of participant observation, which could be, it's also cited as an example of participant observation.
Mm-hmm.
So, which is just another means of collecting data. Yeah.
So how are those different? How are participant observation and ethnography different? One is if you're a participant and you're observing, that's confusing to me. That's
just a method though, right? So you can have participant observation and case study. You can have it in, ethnography.
I could go into a classroom. You know, Sydney's going to go do observations in her schools. She could be, the teacher might say, okay, here, you're going to be part of the lesson. She's now a participant observer because she's taking part in what's going on. Right, Sydney? Wouldn't that be a good example?
Yeah.
So that's where you would an ethnography is a long lasting study.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if Kathleen decided to go live with her mission group and live there for the same amount of time they were, it would be an ethnographic study, not just what they're coming home with, but she lived among them.
Yeah. Cresswell wrote extended observations, right, Anita?
It's
Yeah,
extended.
so
Yeah.
always.
Mhm.
Good, good.
Any other questions I can help anybody with? And like I said, I didn't read off of what I gave you. There's a lot of stuff in there. I gave you a little bit about each of the books. Not Street Corner because we did that one, but for the other books, just so you could see.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, one other question. Is there one particular, it's just based on, the origins are from anthropology, right? There was not one author that, okay, was,
No, well, it starts early on. I think I gave authors, but let's see. Who did I write down? Gertz comes up, Geertz. And his book was The Interpretation of Cultures. But it started earlier than that, because you think about it, Street Corner was in the 1940s. So,
sure.
Right. And don't forget, we talked about a lot of the problems that Street Corner had because it was done before it was really a design process. And
right.
yeah, and
Gertz comes up with that in the 70s.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's also something
You're
called
welcome.
an autoethnography, which
Mhm.
Peg told us we were absolutely not allowed to do. I don't know that any of us were dying to do that anyway, but I have run across a few of those when I was looking at dissertations. So that's kind of interesting, an interesting thing to consider. That you would do an ethnographic study on yourself and your own experiences.
Oh.
sounds good to me.
Sydney. Sydney, you could
Well,
do
then
that,
there
right?
wouldn't be any bias, I guess.
Yeah, I was the person I think Peg shut down first. I wasn't thinking of doing it. I actually can't think of a worse way to do a dissertation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
But I
I'm
don't
gonna
know.
be in my in my head enough anyway. So like, why would I actually just want to study myself more?
The thing I
So-
think is what you ought to do is write the personal autoethnography after you complete your dissertation,
Yeah.
just in terms of what you find, how that was maybe applicable to circumstances you observed. I don't know, might be really interesting.
Well, I've already gotten the same comment from almost everybody I talk to about my new job. Is
Really?
I say, I'm a superintendent, and they say, oh, that's great. How are you going to manage everything? And I said, well, it's actually perfect right now because it's part-time. And they all say the same thing, which is, oh, so you get to still be a mom.
Really?
I mean, almost everybody has said that to me, men and women, everybody. And I keep thinking, well, when I was working full time, I actually was still a mom.
When you're working 3 full-time jobs, you were still a mom.
Yeah.
Hey,
But it's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Kathleen,
What's that, Roy?
follow up and touch a little bit on some of the stuff that you did because it connected. So your
Okay.
research stuff.
Okay. I just kind of went down and tried to pick some things that people hadn't selected. And so Nancy, with participant observation, I just did kind of a brief outline. And you can see how it is kind of the basis of an ethnographic study. Observer gains firsthand knowledge by being in and around the social setting investigated, not just observing what is happening, but also feeling it. So I can see why that is one of the methods used sometimes in phenomenology because it's concerned with the feeling or the context of what you're studying. And it does require training to increase validity and reliability. And we did this in one of our classes. Do you remember when everyone had to do the participant observation?
Yes, Lorraine.
Right. And then there's, of course, White, the Street Corner Society by White is an example that was more in depth. There's another, it's Roy. He worked in a machine shop for 10 months to gain insight about workers' opinions of the system. So he didn't really live amongst the people, but he took a job. So that's kind of like Bernadette saying, maybe I'd, go on a mission. I wouldn't be fully immersed, but for the working hours, I would, be a missionary. The strengths are depth of knowledge. All data collected can be useful. It provides progressive social insights, firsthand primary insight. So you're not listening to someone else's perception of what happened. You have your perception. Good for gaining insight into working habits. The limitations are lack of reliability, and like everyone else has cited, observer bias. Sometimes role conflict can be created, and that conflict can create ethical issues, and can be resource consuming. If you think that you had to observe everything you were going to study firsthand, that would be the the $1 million study. You get to observe people in their natural setting and their behaviors through active participation in the situation. This can also happen as a quantitative method, but it's usually observing behaviors in a controlled lab setting without a participant's awareness or a researcher's involvement. So you're sitting outside a window, they don't know you're watching, that kind of a thing would be considered a participant observation.
How is that participant observation if you're not participating?
Mhm.
Well, I don't know, but it was listed as in a laboratory.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
all right, let's see. Then I did MAC on in-depth interviewing, and I was reading some more about this today. Seidman's protocol, which I'll talk about in a minute, is pretty much structured, and there's semi-structured, and then I came across something today that really skilled researchers use in phenomenology, which is unstructured interviewing.
Mhm.
How about that, huh? So it seems like there's kind of a progression. There's structured, there's semi-structured, and then there's unstructured. So MAC is just this idea of in-depth, which is probably a little bit deeper than Seidman. And I would think this would be used with portraiture and interpretive phenomenological analysis more, because they're trying to get a vivid picture of the participant's perspective. And the person being interviewed is considered the expert, and the interview is considered the student. And so it's really focused on getting the perspective of the individual, that there's not a protocol or specific questions that have to be asked and answered in an order. So I would consider MAC's in-depth interviewing more of a semi-structured. By being attentive to the causal explanations participants provide for what they have experienced and believe, and by actively probing them about the connections and relationships they see between particular events, phenomena, and beliefs. And then I think we're all familiar with Seidman. I just tried to do a brief synopsis, 3 separate interviews, and there's a focus to each interview. So if this will help you remember, interview 1, focus on life history. So for me, if I were to do Seidman's method on the missionary idea, that it would be how they felt, growing up, how their family was accepting when they got their call, how they felt about leaving on their mission, those kinds of things. And then interview 2 would be details of the experience. And then interview 3 is reflection on meaning. And that's pretty structured, where a semi-structured or an unstructured interview, you could go down a pathway that you hadn't anticipated before the interview. So if they brought up something, you're talking about how they felt about going on a mission, and they bring up a mission story, something that happened on their mission. By Seidman's protocol, really you're not supposed to be able to ask those questions, you have to redirect them. But by Reisman is another one that has done the semi-structured, you would be able to mine that question even though it wasn't a part of the plan of the interview. For Seidman, spacing the interviews 3 days to a week apart. I was reading about today in Reisman, who wasn't on the list, but it's just a protocol that I'm looking at. Very often they have you write up your response to the first interview before you look at or conduct the second interview. So it's a little bit more of a linear connection. That's just in some protocols. There's some questions on there, brings in Lincoln and Guba, this idea of trustworthiness. And then I just did a little bit, I couldn't find that much on sensual, but it's ethnographic interviews. And again, that's focusing on to deepen the interview's knowledge of a topic. So you would maybe speak to someone that was directly from that culture and talk about cultural context and relativity to your subject. I see it as, it says it's an open-ended So because the interview is open to all relevant responses. And I try to think of an example. And when we were doing, we did our socioculture class, I was involved in that big choreography thing for a celebration here. And we had some cultural strife that was happening. And I actually did an ethnographic interview with a friend of mine to try and understand this Latino predominance that we had on how to reach them in terms of choreography. And I don't know if you remember, I shared this with you, but one of my choreographers had done this piece where she had 5 purple balls, and there were about 400 kids in the piece, and she had a large Latino contingency. And so she assigned 5 different kids to use the balls, and the choreography was kind of based around these purple balls. And partway through the rehearsal process, she came back the next week, and the kids didn't seem to know their part with the ball. So she went over it again, and on the 3rd week she came back and she realized that the same person didn't have the ball that she'd assigned to have the ball. And what they were doing was they were giving everyone a chance to dance with the ball, where her structure had been that only these five people were assigned to have the ball. So it was a cultural difference there, right? And I realized that as I kind of did this interview with my friend, even though at the time I was just trying to get to, to understand a little bit more how to be a little more culturally aware. So anyway, if that helps you kind of remember that. And I think, is that all that I did? Okay, Brenner, gosh, interviewing and educational research. And this again is an aspect of ethnographic research. Open-ended interviewing, like I talked about, it would be more unstructured. The purpose of open-ended interviewing is to capture the information from and about the informant's reality. So they kind of lead the way. And then, but it's guided by theoretical constructs. So it's more of an inductive approach, focuses on the process of generating rather than particular theoretical content. So deductive approaches seek to test various theories through open-ended interview questions, where inductive, you're trying to consider the theories, consider the possibilities.
Yep. Thank you. Questions for Kathleen?
Sorry if that was a lot.
No, it's very helpful to compare and contrast different pieces, the spectrum of how you can approach interviews. Part of it, what fits and what doesn't. I mean, Seidman is something that got a lot of attention. But again, when I look at Seidman, going back to talking about me, is I don't know that I need to know the full history to find out,
right.
my stuff. So it's different. It does lend itself more to ethnography, the deepness of it, you understanding the culture and all. So there's a place that really seems to make sense to me, and I'll probably dig into that a little further, try to figure it out. Only, what type of study do you think you're doing?
I'm not sure. I might. Seidman makes sense for phenomenology, especially if I'm looking at 6 participants, and then having some sort of very structured method because I am looking at making meaning, and I am also very interested in how things formed. So having a historical piece and a reflective piece with a current piece of what they're doing now makes sense.
So, I mean, from a phenomenology standpoint, I completely agree with you, because if you talk about shared experiences, understanding all those pieces would be critical.
And in particular, the 3rd part, which is reflecting on the meaning of the experience, really applies to conflict handling, because I want them to think about their methods and their choices and why they chose something, because I'm looking at there are different theoretical constructs that exist, but they don't look into more reasons why. And so that's what I'm really interested in. So I think that's why it makes more sense to use Seidman's for me. I was just wondering, I can't imagine when an unstructured interview would work other than you happen to run into somebody that may be able to offer valuable information. Is there?
Well, you have the data points, but look at Bernadette's topic. I mean, Seidman isn't going to really serve her well if she's doing a narrative, right? Because she's going to have her her bones that she's trying to fit this story into, where she needs to do more unstructured or semi-structured to follow the trail of the story as it unfolds, which is kind of a vulnerable place to be in as a researcher, I think. And everything I can read about it seems to say that. But she'll go in with an objective, but she's not going to be in control, or she doesn't want to control how that story unfolds. She's going to have to be willing to follow that, I think, because mine is kind of partway between the two. I want to understand this phenomena from some outliers that I have, but that's a looser structure than really trying to get a sense of their feeling of this phenomenon for me. So I'm kind of straddling.
Using Seidman's, we can still use semi-structured interviewing process, correct?
Yeah, but you'd have to do a version of Seidman, a variation on Seidman, because he's pretty clear about what his protocol is, I think.
Could you be semi-structured?
Thinking of doing an artifact interview, where you have them name a meaningful artifact and talk about it.
As I read Seidman, it sounded to me, stop me if I'm wrong, that if your participant brought up something that wasn't a part of the planned interview, that you had to redirect back to your planned interview topic. You couldn't follow that down. That's how I understood it in its strictest form. I could be wrong though.
Well, I would think that if you're interviewing and you're talking about the history and they go down a path you didn't know, that's a semi-structured, but you're not going to, if they start talking about something that would be an interview number 2, that you may not go that path. So that's the way why I feel like, you can't let it diverge as long as it's within a context.
Right. And I looked at it more broadly as to Seidman's idea of looking at the history, looking at the details of the experience, and then the reflections on the meaning of the experience as general goals for the interview, and then having semi-structured discussions so that I could inquire and look at, because I don't know what I'm looking for, right? Qualitative is inductive. And so I don't know. I would go back to talking about the history, but I would probably follow different lines. That's what I was hoping to do when I ask questions.
You think you'll ask about artifacts that are meaningful?
You mean, will I?
Yeah.
Pauline? Is that what you're asking, Anita?
Yeah, for Pauline, I'm just wondering if when you're talking to people about their conflict handling.
Yeah, I don't know if artifacts more than I would use an artifact such as, because that's considered an artifact, their CV, to look at their background to see whether they had any training, any kind of experiences with handling conflict.
Well, I wonder, like, if they were to draw something that represent, I don't know, I'm thinking out of the box.
Yeah, that's, I would think, as part of making meaning also. I mean, it could be part of that, but I have to look at it more carefully.
Very interesting.
It's interesting, though.
Very.
Yeah, one of the things I see here, I just looking at some stuff on the computer. Unstructured approaches, they reference that you do that in ethnography, which makes sense. Grounded theory and phenomenology are places where that might be used.
Unstructured, completely unstructured?
Yes, that's well. They say that it says.
You could use it there. I could see that. Ethnography, phenomenology, and what else?
Ethnography, phenomenology, and grounded theory.
Grounded theory. Yeah.
So, ethnography and grounded theory makes sense. Phenomenology, I understand it. You think you want to be semi-structured that, but I'm not.
Yeah. I think so.
Well, unless you're doing narrative phenomenology,
And the other issue just about unstructured interviews, although they may well yield unexpected response, they make it difficult to compare findings across cases. right? So if you don't have something, so that's why in ethnography, you're looking at this holistic
Right.
thing versus in a phenomenology. If you don't have something similar, if you're so unstructured, how do you find the common themes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they merge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, hopefully by your sample group, right?
Yeah.
Maybe for you for missionaries, but for me, for administrators, maybe they didn't think about conflict handling. So I would need to bring up the topic.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I'm looking at transitions, so I've got an agenda, I guess, in a way, but it's not really a defined story agenda because it's, I think, going to be different for every participant. So I think too, also, if you did a multiple interview protocol with semi-structured, the places that it didn't go, if you went back and looked at that, you could focus your next interview on. So there's probably more than one way to skin the beast.
I think a lot of the analysis flows into what I was supposed to cover tonight, and that's discourse analysis and how to look at what they're talking about and how to compare and contrast the two different things.
Nice segue, go.
Wasn't that great? Basically,
Extra
what
points for smooth transition.
Extra points, cool. Does that mean I don't have to take the comps?
Yep.
So basically what I covered was a comparison contrast of discourse analysis and content analysis, which are the qualitative and quantitative brothers of analyzing texts or text that people talk about or written text. It can be pre-existing text or the text from an interview. The qualitative method is the discourse analysis. Big difference between the two of them is one is the realist perspective, that's the quantitative perspective. The other is the constructionist perspective, and it takes in the context, that's the discourse analysis. Content analysis, of course, is quantitative, so you're doing a lot of counting, a lot of scientific methodology to compare texts. And it doesn't necessarily link what you're talking about to the context, where the discourse analysis can only be understood within the context of the society that the discourse exists in. I sent you a link to a discourse analysis shared paper. And the big guy in discourse analysis is Michael Foucault. That's where it all came from. He wrote a book in 1969 called The Archaeology of Knowledge. And that's basically, it's about the role of discourse concepts in social sciences. And it inspired that this was the beginning of discourse analysis. Hold on, my cats are driving me crazy here. And his theories were built upon by a guy in Germany, Rainer Keller. He took a couple of sociology people, Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, and took their theories and combined them with Foucault's theories and came up with what he calls the sociology of knowledge approach to discourse, SKAD. And what that does is that analyzes knowledge relationships and conditions in society based on textual analysis. If you look at that paper I gave you the link to, go all the way to the end of it. I created a chart that compares discourse analysis and content analysis on a bunch of different things, their ontology, their epistemology, data sources, and things like that. I'm not going to insult you by reading the whole thing, But basically what it says is that one is more subjective, one's objective, one's deductive, one's inductive. And it all comes back to the ontology of the content analysis being a realist, and reality is assumes that independent reality exists, is the way it was put it. And discourse analysis is constructionist because it assumes that reality is constructed socially. So basically, I boiled that down to meaning one's contextless, one only exists within the context of the society.
Did we spend much time on content analysis or discourse analysis? Because
with Megan a little bit.
Yeah, Megan touched on it.
Would we use it in deciphering artifacts, or?
You could decipher artifacts. You can decipher interviews.
Yeah,
it's any kind of area where text exists.
You know, I read it was a Coding Today on a qualitative interview, and the person changed tenses. So they were talking about themselves in the present, and then they changed to past tense. And I think that's an example of discourse analysis.
Mm-hmm.
As they analyzed that, and you could see that clearly in the text that they had changed tenses, and then they shadowed that with some kind of meaning. What the person was saying had to do with their perception of their self and how their identity was changing, and they used that artifact, for lack of a better term, of discourse analysis and changing tenses to kind of portray this idea of, you know, struggling with self-identity. So I don't know if that helps. Is that right, Karen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is right. Another thing is that, you know how when you're looking at interviews, you're making memos and trying to paraphrase sometimes, trying to make themes. In content analysis, you can't do that because those words aren't exactly what were said.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in discourse analysis, you can use the context of what is said and try to come up with themes and change the words a little bit.
And tell me the difference again between discourse and content.
Discourse analysis is the qualitative version, that everything is in context of everything around it.
Okay, so you could do the same document both with discourse and content.
Yes.
So,
one is totally a numeric. How many times does the word hourly appear when you're talking about salaries?
Sure.
Are you talking salaried people? Are you talking hourly people? How many times does that? You know, it's totally a numeric analysis that can be brought down to some mathematical calculations.
Right. So one of the things an artifact that I would want to look at is potentially board meeting minutes. Would I analyze those with a discourse analysis, or would
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
or would I just code them, or how?
could do
It
both.
really depends on what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point.
So if you're looking for the number of times someone said a word that related to solving a problem or struggling, for example, and you counted that in the number, that would be the content analysis, correct?
That's right.
Right.
Versus
There is counting in discourse analysis. There is counting, but it's not the focus of it. The focus is trying to figure out context.
Context. So
how is discourse
taking that
analysis
same
different from
example, it would
coding?
be kind of interpreting what the person was saying about
Right.
the struggle
Okay.
at that moment.
There's more of an interpretive analysis for discourse analysis, whereas content analysis, you are looking at what exists.
So let's say Roy's example of being at a board meeting, maybe he wanted to look at the attendance of individuals on the board over a 12-month period. How many times this person was present, how many times this person was present, what percentage of a quorum they had at each board meeting. That would be content analysis.
That's content analysis.
Where I'm getting lost is discourse analysis to evaluate it versus could I just code a again, not content. You do use coding mechanisms to analyze the document, or is that in fact discourse analysis?
The coding is discourse analysis. If you are looking at something that can be brought down to statistical analysis, that's content analysis.
Got it. Thank you.
Within the coding, correct?
Right.
So,
Like for instance, one of the interview that I did, that we had to transcribe, the person I interviewed, when I'd asked them something that maybe they were a little uncomfortable, well, that was part of my assessment at the end, but she would laugh. So there was kind of laughter, and I didn't really realize it when I was doing the interview, but when I was transcribing it, I could see that. So I could do a discourse analysis of that, which was to kind of interpret the meaning behind that laughter, or I could do a content analysis, which would be to count the number of times that she laughed and maybe, what preceded it and what came after.
Got
Right?
it.
Right.
Great.
Okay. That's an example.
All right. That was very helpful. Thank you. That was a good conversation. Does anybody?
Yeah,
else
the paper was a bit longer than that I sent out, but I know it had authors and books and stuff if you wanted to go into a little bit more depth.
Great.
Thanks,
Does
Karen.
anybody else have another topic that they planned on talking on tonight or would like to talk on tonight? One of the things we haven't touched on, and I think next week we move into leadership, was focus groups. Is there anything worthwhile talking about there, or is that pretty straightforward? There's a data collection method. I'm not suggesting we do that. I'm asking the question. I'm trying to, but we can always touch on that another time. But we're about an hour into this, so I want to see if people want to are good, and we'll reconvene next week. Do
we have a plan for leadership, or we just?
Yeah, people sign up.
I'm doing Margaret Wheatley.
Oh gosh, I didn't see the sign-up sheet. How did I miss that?
It was the same one as the other one.
maybe you just have to scroll to the right.
Oh, okay. My bad.
Yeah, I just got Margaret Wheatley's new book in the mail. Her new book just came out. So not that I'm going to read it now, but
Are you having lunch with her too?
I would try. I would try. I'm like a stalker.
I signed up. Sorry.
I'm a groupie. I'm going to try and make up some of my absent time by doing some like more thematic, like structural kind of stuff for leadership. Because that's what concerns me a little bit is like we're picking leaders, but I feel like personally I don't have a handle on how they all fit together. Like if there was a question about transformational leadership, I wouldn't know who to group in there, to be honest, at this point. So I need to sort of visually map it out.
Will you share that with us when you do?
Oh, yeah, that's why I'm going to do it.
Yeah, I think you're.
I do have to tell you there's a local emergency in my town. Just to let you know, there's a loose herd of bison running around Guilford today.
Jeez. It's funny for me because I switch from being worried about each comp differently. I'm like, oh, I'm going to have a hard time with research. And then, well, research, I'll be okay. And I'm going to have a hard time with, socioculture. Oh, I'll be okay. And I said, oh, I think that, leadership, makes sense to me. But again, the problem is what the questions are and how much we have to do it. So I think that that's good. And I think our days together beforehand are going to be extremely helpful because these conversations will get deeper and stronger and better.
Will you remind us again of the order?
Somebody said it last week, and I never asked the question.
Leadership first, and then I'm almost sure that it's socio last, and
research in the middle.
Yeah,
that's what you said last time.
I'm almost sure.
I'll ask the question. I forgot.
My notes, and I had just read it, and then when I said it, I had it for sure, but now I don't have it for sure. I know leadership is first.
Well, ultimately,
you said leadership, then research, then sociocultural. So that's the same.
I think that's what it is.
At this point, it probably doesn't matter, but as we get together and work towards Friday, it will matter because what I want to review Friday is what I'm going to be doing Friday, right?
Mhm.
Would you want to
Yep.
review Thursday or Friday? Friday morning, you mean? Like,
Yeah.
do
So
it.
I want,
Every day it's 1 to 4.
Okay, well, that's great.
So Sid's going to take it in the morning one of those.
Yeah, Sydney, if you need any help on that, that grid, if you build it and want other people to, I'm happy to help on that and populate it too. So just let me know if you want to make it a document, and a couple of us could work on it together. I'm trying to do that if I can for sociocultural, if I can box the categories a little bit. I think at least, yeah, I like that idea because that really works with my way of learning, but we'll see.
Mhm.
I'm saying.
Yeah, so I might actually change my person. I was going to do Young Sal for future, but he's just not one of the big ones. So, there's plenty to choose from. I think I'm just going to switch to somebody else as I start to, if I try and do that thematic kind of thing.
There are a million
You
of
know,
them.
I wouldn't mind having a review of Wheatley because I feel like I'd like to bring her up, but I'm really nervous if I don't know her really, really well. So.
Ada, you said you're doing Wheatley?
Anita's doing
Yeah, I'm
Oh.
doing her.
Okay.
And I think a lot of expertise exists in the group already. Karen and Sid did a lot with her already when they presented. But I got some things to share, so I started it.
Great.
so I'm on her listserv and I got an invitation this week now that her book is coming out to see if I'd like to do her professional development to be a leader warrior.
Oh,
Because that's what she calls it. She calls it leader warrior training.
Oh,
Now,
geez.
there's no way that in my lifetime I would have the time or the money to do it.
Yeah.
You like go to Utah for a couple months in the year and,
Who would come to Utah? I mean, really.
well, I would not, you know what I mean? I wouldn't be able to actually afford to go to Utah and not work for a couple of months. So
You could
More
stay with
power-
me.
Hire you.
more power to the people who have that time and money, but I'm not one of them. But it does sound fun.
Does.
All right. I'm going to call it a meeting unless somebody wants to continue.
Oh, Roy, you said you wanted to talk about regression.
Oh,
You
no,
want to talk about
I wasn't. No, we were talking about it earlier. I'm going to regress right now.
All right, good.
But that's the topics we can touch on, and those are things we can
Not regress.
Okay, just didn't want you to lose that if you meant that you wanted to talk about it tonight.
No, that was chatter.
Sydney, you have all our phone numbers. So after you take the research comp on Saturday, you're going to text us all the questions.
All right. Now, is one of the questions on ethics?
Yeah. Just omit that one. Just omit that one.
Okay.
I'm glad they're working it out for you, and we'll be rooting for you.
Did they approve it for you?
Sorry, Roy?
Did they approve you to do it early?
Well, Peg said yes, and then she told me to send her a reminder email, which I did, and then I just haven't heard anything since then. So it might take a couple of face-to-face reminders that somebody needs to be there. But just with everything that's happened with my family, I do appreciate that I'm not going to miss this wedding.
No,
Yeah.
too important.
Well, we'll be there in spirit, like, cramming our brains out. So you'll be alone in the room, but you won't be alone in spirit.
Okay.
Be telepathic, but be ethical.
Yeah.
All right. Let's call it a meet. All right.
It was good to see everybody again. I've missed you all.
Good to see Anita. Oh, Anita.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
How do I end this?